Clara had just wrapped up her late shift at the small, bustling restaurant downtown. The night had dragged on, and she was exhausted. The air in New York was thick with the kind of humidity that made everything feel sticky, even the underground, subway stations. It was just past midnight when she entered the 42nd Street subway station, her eyes heavy with fatigue. The station felt unusually empty, even for the late hour. The platforms that normally buzzed with commuters and the rush of trains were silent. She glanced around the platform, but it felt almost deserted, with just a handful of tired-looking commuters standing by the edges of the platform, their faces dimly lit by the flickering lights above. Clara checked the time on the digital clock, noticing that the next train wouldn't come for another 10 minutes. She sighed, choosing a nearby bench to sit and wait. She leaned back and closed her eyes for a moment, hoping to rest before her ride home. It had been a long day, and all she could think about was getting back to her apartment. Yet something felt strange about this night. The usual buzz of the city and the distant sound of the train seemed subdued, as though the city itself was holding its breath. Clara shook the thought off. After all, it was just the late hour playing tricks on her mind. She was tired, she told herself. That was all. As the minutes passed, the quiet grew deeper. The station had the usual dark corners, but tonight the shadows felt heavier. Clara's eyes scanned the platform. A few people shuffled by, but there was something different about them too. They seemed more distant, more absorbed in their phones or gazing blankly at the tracks. She couldn't remember the last time she'd seen such a quiet subway station. Normally, even at this hour, you could hear the shuffle of footsteps, muffled conversations, or the occasional call-out. But tonight, everything was eerily still. The hum of the fluorescent lights overhead seemed louder than usual, filling the space with an almost oppressive noise. Clara glanced over her shoulder, half expecting to see someone standing there, but the platform remained empty behind her. She glanced at the exit, then back at the platform. There were only a few others waiting for the train. None of them looked up or moved, their postures stiff as though they were frozen in place. Clara's heart skipped a beat as she noticed that some of them weren't even holding their phones properly. Their fingers barely twitched as if they were stuck in a trance. The emptiness of the station felt unnatural. It wasn't just the lack of sound. It was the stillness, the absence of the usual bustle. Clara's chest tightened as she tried to shake off the feeling of discomfort, but something deep in her gut told her this wasn't just normal subway fatigue. This felt wrong. The far-off rumble of a train finally broke the silence, sending a brief wave of relief through Clara. The lights on the platform flickered momentarily, then dimmed as the next train approached. Clara stood up and pulled her jacket tighter around herself as the train slid into the station. But when the doors opened, Clara froze. The train was old, uncomfortably so. The metal was rusted, the paint on the exterior chipped and faded, as though it hadn't seen an update in decades. It was the kind of train that seemed to belong in a time long past, an outdated relic of New York's subway system. She blinked and rubbed her eyes, wondering if she was seeing things. But when she looked again, the train's peeling paint and rusted exterior didn't change. Something about it felt wrong, like it had just arrived from another time. Yet, there was no other train in sight. This was the last one of the night. Clara hesitated, unsure whether to get on. It looked like the kind of train that could be heading straight to the graveyard of abandoned tunnels. But she didn't want to wait another 10 minutes, and so reluctantly she stepped inside. Clara's instincts told her to turn back, but it was too late. The doors slid shut behind her with an unsettling, almost unnatural hiss. The few passengers on the train didn't seem to notice her as she walked down the aisle. The train car was dim, and the flickering lights overhead added an extra layer of unease. The seats were occupied, but none of the passengers moved. They were sitting motionless, staring blankly ahead. Clara took an empty seat near the middle of the car. The other passengers didn't acknowledge her presence. They simply remained frozen in place as if they were statues. Their clothes were nondescript, plain. A man near the door had a trench coat draped over his shoulders, but his eyes were lifeless, his pupils dilated, staring into nothing. A woman opposite Clara gripped her purse with both hands, her knuckles white. But it was the look on their faces that unsettled Clara the most. They were pale, drained, and had a distant, glazed-over expression, as though they weren't fully there. It was the kind of stare someone might have if they were in a trance, vacant, unseeing. Clara swallowed hard, but she couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. These passengers didn't belong here. Something about them didn't belong in the world at all. She glanced away, trying to focus on the track outside the window, but the uneasy feeling gnawed at her. As the train began to move deeper into the tunnels, Clara felt a strange heaviness in the air. The train's movement was smooth, but there was a deep, disconcerting silence. Normally, she would hear the sound of the train's wheels rumbling along the tracks or the air conditioning humming quietly overhead. But tonight there was nothing. The quiet was thick and suffocating. The other passengers remained unmoving, their eyes still blank and unblinking. The air in the car felt unnaturally cold, even though it was summer outside. The fluorescent lights above flickered again, casting eerie shadows that seemed to stretch out, warping the walls of the train car. The further they went into the tunnel, the deeper the silence became. Clara checked her watch. Time was dragging on. The train should have been stopping by now. The next station was only a few minutes away, but the train seemed to be picking up speed. She felt a cold shiver run through her body. This wasn't right. Clara's unease grew with every passing minute. The train was picking up speed, but it wasn't making any stops. She had been riding for nearly 20 minutes now, and she was sure they should have passed several stations by now. The absence of the usual train noises, the rattle of wheels against tracks, the hum of the lights, the distant sound of passengers coming and going was deafening. The silence pressed in on her, suffocating her. Clara turned to glance at the other passengers once more, and her breath caught in her throat. They hadn't moved. They hadn't even blinked. Their vacant eyes remained locked forward, their faces expressionless and still like something not quite human. Clara swallowed and stood up, walking to the door to push the button to get off. But the door didn't open. She pushed again, harder, this time, but the door remained stubbornly shut. Her pulse quickened as she glanced up at the sign above the door. The route map, which should have been flashing the station names as they passed them, was blank. Nothing was showing. Clara's panic rose. What was going on? She pressed the door again and again, but it wouldn't open. Where was the next stop? Clara could feel the weight of her fear rising in her chest. The train was moving faster now, the lights above flickering wildly as it careened through the tunnel. They should have passed several stations by now, but the train didn't slow, didn't stop. The car was growing colder by the second, the oppressive silence wrapping around her like a vice. What was happening? She glanced at her phone, hoping for some sign of connection, some sense of reality, but there was no signal. No bars, just a blank screen. Clara looked at the other passengers again. They were still unmoving. They hadn't even noticed the train was going faster. She could hear the wheels screeching now, a high-pitched whine that filled the air. This wasn't normal. She turned to face the front of the car, looking toward where the conductor's booth should be. But it was empty. The area was just a dark void, the shadow of a man-sized figure barely visible. Where was the conductor? The intercom crackled to life with a distorted voice, low and echoing through the car. Clara jumped, her heart racing. The voice was mechanical, warped, like it was being filtered through a broken speaker. "Welcome aboard, the last train." Clara froze. The words rattled through her skull, their meaning sinking into her brain with a sickening heaviness. The last train. Her blood ran cold. The train was the last one of the night, but the voice's tone, so final, so devoid of any emotion, made it sound like a warning. A sense of dread settled over her like a dark cloud. She turned to the other passengers, desperate for some reassurance, but none of them moved. Their faces were still blank, their eyes unfocused. They were lifeless. Clara's hand trembled as she reached for the door again, but the button didn't work. She pulled harder, panic welling up inside her. There was no escape. The doors wouldn't open, the train wouldn't stop. What was going on in Inger's faces? Change. Clara's eyes darted around the train, searching for any sign of help or reassurance, but she found none. The silence was suffocating, and the eerie stillness of the passengers was driving her to the edge. As she scanned the faces of the others in the car, she felt her stomach churn. They weren't just blank anymore, they were staring directly at her. Their vacant expressions hadn't changed, but now their eyes seemed to pierce into her very soul. It was as if they had all collectively noticed her for the first time, their eyes locking on her with an unnerving intensity. One passenger, a man sitting near the middle of the car, tilted his head slowly, his eyes unblinking, his mouth twisted into a faint, unsettling smile. The gesture was so slow and deliberate that it sent a wave of dread through Clara. She instinctively stepped back, her heart thudding in her chest, but no one moved. The other passengers' eyes followed her every motion, their heads slowly turning in unison as if they were puppets controlled by a single mind. Clara's mind raced. What were these people? Their skin was pale, too pale, and their features seemed to distort slightly as though they weren't quite right. She had never seen them blink or move their mouths to speak, and as the train sped through the darkness, she could feel their eyes still boring into her, following her every breath. The sensation was overwhelming. The walls of the train car, which had once been the familiar place she'd ridden countless times, now felt like a cage, one she couldn't escape. She glanced at the door again, but it was still sealed tightly, shut. The train rattled against the tracks with an unnatural force, as if they were speeding through a void. There was no turning back now. She was trapped with these strange, silent passengers who felt more like the dead than the living. Clara tried to focus on the faint outline of the front of the train, hoping to see the conductor or any kind of explanation for what was happening. But when she turned, her blood froze in her veins. A figure stood at the far end of the car, shrouded in shadow, motionless like a statue. At first, Clara thought it was just a trick of the dim lighting, but then she saw him move. A tall, thin man dressed in a conductor's uniform appeared to be the source of the oppressive atmosphere hanging over the train. His features were pale, gaunt, and hollowed out as though he hadn't seen daylight in years. His eyes were dark, sunken, but it was his smile that truly terrified Clara. It was wide, far too wide, stretching across his face like a grotesque, manic grin. His teeth were unnaturally sharp, gleaming in the low light, and as he approached her, the stench of decay and rot followed him like a cloud. Clara could hardly breathe as the conductor's gaze locked with hers. He took one deliberate step toward her, and Clara couldn't stop herself from backing away, her body trembling in fear. He said nothing. His lips never moved, but she could feel the weight of his presence like an invisible hand wrapping around her chest. The passengers, still sitting motionless, seemed to sense his presence as well. They turned their heads slightly as though acknowledging him, but none of them made a sound. The conductor's smile only grew wider, impossibly so, as though it was stretching beyond the natural limits of the human mouth. Clara's mind raced. Was he the one controlling this train? Was he the one in charge of all this? As the conductor moved closer, his unnerving smile never faltered. He didn't speak, but his presence was suffocating, like a shadow growing heavier with every passing second. Clara's legs were rooted to the floor, her body paralyzed by the terror gripping her. He stopped right in front of her, standing inches away, towering over her, his dark eyes locked onto hers with a cold, calculated gaze. There was something disturbingly familiar about the conductor's look. Where had she seen that expression before? Without warning, the conductor's thin, bony fingers reached out and gently touched Clara's arm. The icy chill of his touch sent a shock of terror straight through her, freezing her in place. She could feel the grip of something unnatural, something dead, as his hand lingered on her skin. His smile stretched wider, revealing a row of yellowed, sharp teeth that gleamed with an unnatural light. He leaned in close, and his voice, low, cold, and guttural, whispered into her ear. "You shouldn't have boarded," he rasped, his breath like ice against her skin. "You never should have boarded the last train." The word sent a jolt of panic through Clara. She struggled to move, to scream, but her body wouldn't obey. His words echoed in her mind, growing louder and louder as they reverberated through the hollow train car. The other passengers were still silent, motionless, as if they were all trapped in the same hypnotic state, waiting for something. Waiting for the conductor to speak. "You're trapped now," the conductor continued, his grin impossibly wide. "This is the last train, and you will never leave." Clara's breath hitched in her throat. The horror of the situation overwhelmed her, and she finally found the strength to step back, but the conductor's gaze followed her every move. Clara's heart raced as the train's screeching wheels reached a fever pitch. Her mind screamed for her to escape, but there was nowhere to run. The train, moving faster than any subway car should, seemed to be hurtling toward a destination, unknown. It was no longer even a train, it was a dark force, a twisted entity that had pulled her into its grip. The train didn't stop. There were no stations, no signs of civilization. The only thing that existed was the endless, suffocating tunnel stretching out into the void. As the lights flickered one final time, the train screeched to an abrupt halt, plunging the car into complete darkness. For a brief, terrifying moment, Clara thought she had lost her mind entirely. Her panic reached its peak as the walls of the train seemed to close in on her. The conductor's voice, distorted and hollow, echoed once again. "Welcome to your final ride," he intoned, the words chilling her to her core. The door to the train car opened slowly, but beyond it was nothing, just a black, infinite void. It was as though the station itself had vanished and she was standing at the precipice of some dark dimension. Clara reached out, desperate to escape, but the train car shuddered as if to warn her. The other passengers, motionless, lifeless, remained, seated, their vacant gazes locked onto her. With a trembling hand, Clara stepped toward the doorway, her foot hovering over the threshold. But before she could cross into the dark unknown, the door slammed shut, trapping her inside. The train began moving once more, faster than ever, leaving her no choice but to accept her fate. The endless tunnel stretched before her, her last ride in the cursed, unending nightmare of the last train.